Hi students, in this video we're going to be talking about measuring behavior at baseline, treatment, and follow-up. So let's get started. There are three general ways to assess behavior. They involve indirect assessment, direct assessment, and experimental assessment. Let's talk about each one. With indirect assessment, the clinician or therapist typically does not see the behavior. Now this might be a behavior that just doesn't manifest in the office. The clinician's in the office with the client, with the individual with the behavior, and the individual's not showing the behavior. Maybe it's a type of anxiety, maybe it's a type of fear, maybe it's a type of behavioral deficit or excess, but that's not something that's possible to show in the office. Additionally, it could be some kind of a behavior that's covert, some kind of an internal behavior. It might have to do with the number of negative self-statements the individual makes. That's not something that the clinician can easily see. So with indirect assessment, because the therapist can't see the behavior, there are other approaches to collecting the information. So for the most part, the information about the target needs to come from the client or from others. It might come from family members. If this is a child, it might come from teachers or other individuals that are familiar with this client. And it may include one or more different procedures. It might mean that the therapist is going to do an intake interview with the individual, might be administering different questionnaires, might be engaged in role playing, or the client might be engaged in self-monitoring. So there are ways to tap into the behavior without actually seeing the behavior. So in this slide we have examples of questions that a behavior therapist typically asks during an intake interview, and all of these questions come directly from your book. So what seems to be the problem? Can you describe what you typically say or do when you experience the problem? How often does it occur? How long has the problem been occurring? In what situations does it occur? So in other words, what sets it off? This is kind of trying to tap into the antecedents. What tends to occur immediately after you experience the problem, and this tends to tap into the consequences. What are you typically thinking or feeling when this occurs? This gets into some of the covert behaviors. And have you tried to deal with this problem so far? How have you tried to deal with this? So what has been attempted? Now again, these are all questions that are in your book too, so it's good to go ahead and take a look at that. So other ways to assess these behaviors, one that is mentioned in your book is the Lazarus and Lazarus Multimodal Life History Inventory. Now this is a copyrighted inventory, and it is something that the clinician would probably sit down and ask the client to work on together. And so I've got a couple of the questions posted here. I'm not going to post the entire thing because, as I said, it's copyrighted, and for the most part training is required to be able to use it. But I just wanted to give you a sense about what kinds of things are assessed on this inventory. So obviously, name of the individual, the presenting problems, sharing your own words, the nature of the problems, how upsetting is the problem, and then different kinds of behaviors, the behaviors that apply to the individual. Is the individual overeating, taking drugs, vomiting, engaging in odd behavior? So any of these kinds of behaviors the person is asked to identify. What are the specific behaviors that you want to change? What are specific talents or skills you're proud of? What would you like to do more of? So this is tapping into deficits. What would you like to do less of? This is tapping into excesses. What would you like to get started doing? Again, that's some kind of a deficit. What can we increase? So this is an example that's discussed in the book. I just wanted to kind of show you what it looked like. Additionally, this is a self-monitoring form. I want to show you this example. This is oftentimes used in schools for getting children to pay attention to their own behavior. And so this is a self-monitoring form asking a child to pay attention. Was I paying attention to my assigned work? Was I following the class rules? And to be doing this across the multiple classes of the day. And the student's going to be tracking this and then asking the teacher to track this. And because it says my goal, this indicates that this might be used not just for initial assessments, but for tracking behavior across time. Now, the last thing that's listed over here is a self-care assessment, and this was originally posted by therapistaid.com, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in Moodle so you can take a look at it if you want. And I think that this is a really good way to kind of tap into what might be some target behaviors for yourself for this class. So it gets you to evaluate your physical self-care, there's emotional self-care, there's social self-care, what are you doing poorly or not often, what are you doing often. So again, tapping into what are deficits, what are excesses, and what would you like to improve. And as I said, I will post this to Moodle. If you'd like to go ahead and fill it out, you're welcome to do that. And so these are all forms of indirect assessment. There's also direct assessment, and this is when the clinician or therapist directly observes and records the behavior. So this would be a clinician observing the client in their home or in some kind of a social situation. If the client is a child, it might be observing the child in the classroom. Now this is obviously more accurate than the indirect because the clinician has kind of first-hand experience with what's going on. But as you can imagine, this is much less practical. It's very time-consuming and it can be much more expensive. So in terms of observing the target behavior, this might be something that takes a week or so to just observe, and this is going to be very expensive because it requires a lot of time from the clinician. And again, it's not possible to observe those kinds of covert behaviors. So if this is the client engaging in negative self-thoughts or something that the clinician cannot see, then this won't work. The last approach to assessment is sometimes referred to as experimental assessment, and this is going to be happening within an experimental setting. And this is where the clinician is carefully controlling the behavioral measures as well as the treatments. So controlling what happens to the target behavior, controlling what happens in terms of interventions, and controlling all other aspects of the environment so that the clinician can identify what is being manipulated, what is being measured, and how it is affecting the behavior. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is, why do we have to engage in all this assessment? Why do we have to collect all this data? Isn't it enough to just maybe collect data across a couple of days, get a sense about what's happening, and then make some conclusions? Well, as we mentioned already, behavior modification is very focused on assessment from baseline all the way through follow-up. So it's really important to be collecting data throughout the whole process. So that's important so that we can really show effectiveness with data. It's not just I believe that something is changing for myself, or as a therapist I believe that something is changing. We can actually show it with the data. So collecting data often gives us insights into the target behavior, more information about the target behavior. As we mentioned in the last video, sometimes just collecting data on the target indicates that it's really not the problem that we thought it was. So remember the example I gave you with a student in class thinking that watching TV was a behavioral excess. It really wasn't a problem behavior. And it might be that collecting data shows us this isn't a problem, but maybe we have another target behavior that we should focus on instead. It often facilitates development of the best treatment strategy. So if we can figure out what the target is, we have a better idea about what to do to change the target. We have to collect data so we have ideas about what are the controlling variables. And by controlling variables, we're talking about, again, the antecedents. What are the triggers? What gets something to happen? And then what are the consequences? What happens after the behavior? Now, we call these controlling variables because we believe that they control what's happening with regard to the target behavior. It's important in behavior modification to publicly post the results because that oftentimes increases accountability. So as you are working on your behavior modification projects, I'm going to encourage you to take your results and to put them out there and make other people aware of what you're working on, because in doing that, if other people know that you're trying to change a target behavior, they can provide support, but they also can make you feel more accountable. If you are not engaging in what you need to do to change a target behavior, other people know about it, and this oftentimes prompts performance. And then finally, what we've seen is that direct observation may facilitate change. So if you are just simply tracking your behavior, you are going to notice what you're doing, and it's going to be likely to facilitate change. Now, this is sometimes referred to as reactivity. So you are changing just because you are either being observed by somebody else or observing yourself. But and in which case, it might not be the treatment that is changing your behavior, but the truth is, if you are changing the behavior in the direction that you want to change it, you're still benefiting from the observation. All right, now we're going to go ahead and pause here, and then we're going to come back and talk about characteristics of behavior for assessment.